She had walked into countless rooms like this before, but none felt quite like this one. The lights were bright but cold, casting long shadows across tables laid with fine china and crystal glasses that gleamed like ice. Waiters moved quickly, their movements practiced and smooth, carrying trays that jangled softly with the sound of polished silverware. The guests were dressed in suits and elegant dresses, their laughter light but deliberate, almost rehearsed. Every word they spoke seemed to weigh heavily with importance, as if the air itself carried the pressure of wealth and influence. She held her tray a little tighter than usual, feeling the weight of the glasses pressing into her palm. Her shoes clicked quietly against the polished floor, but even the softest steps seemed loud in this environment. She tried to make herself small, invisible. This was not her world. She was a visitor in a place that moved on a rhythm she did not know, and yet there was a strange pull, a curiosity that kept her feet moving forward. Her eyes kept drifting to the corner of the room where the grand piano stood. It was massive, black, and polished to perfection, catching the light in a way that made it impossible to ignore. It was more than just an instrument. It was a centerpiece, an unspoken challenge, a reminder that beauty could exist in places even the ordinary could not touch. She had not touched a piano in years. It's not since life had taken her away from the small music room she used to escape to as a child. The keys had been a refuge, a friend that understood the things no one else could. And now, here it sat, so close and yet so far, in a place where someone like her was only meant to serve and vanish. She moved from table to table, offering wine and water, smiling when it was expected, nodding politely when someone made a comment about the food. Each interaction felt like walking on a tightrope. One wrong word, one slow movement, and she would be noticed in the wrong way. Most of the guests did not even look at her, their eyes darting past, seeking conversation, attention, and validation from each other. She observed quietly, noting the little things others missed, the way a hand trembled slightly as someone lifted a glass, the faint smile that did not quite reach the eyes, the way someone's posture tightened when they were being watched. These small details were invisible to the world, but not to her. She had learned long ago how to see what others ignored, how to listen to more than just words. At the far end of the room, a small group had gathered around a table, their voices louder than the rest. They were discussing deals, money, and plans that seemed to float above her like clouds she could not reach. She pretended to adjust a napkin, moving closer only slightly, careful to stay in the shadows. And then she saw, at a brief pause, a hesitation, almost imperceptible, as if something was missing. Her heart skipped, not because she was part of their world, but because she knew instinctively that music could fill that space. A guest dropped a fork, the clatter ringing louder than expected. Conversations faltered, laughter stuttered, and the room shifted slightly, like it had noticed a change in energy. Her hand shook for a moment as she reached for the next glass. She took a deep breath and reminded herself that she was just a waitress here. Her music was her secret, her past, her escape. It had no place in a room like this. And yet, the urge was undeniable. Her fingers itched, her chest tightened, a silent song begging to be heard. As she moved past the piano, she caught her reflection in the polished surface. She looked tired, worn, a little out of place, but there was something in her eyes that the guests could not see. Determination, maybe, or the faint glimmer of hope that still lingered after years of hard work. She kept walking, kept serving, but every step felt heavier with the weight of what she carried inside her. She remembered long nights playing in small, empty rooms, feeling the vibration of the keys under her fingers and how it had made the world make sense, even when nothing else did. At one table, a man gestured for more wine, speaking in a tone that demanded immediate attention. She poured without hesitation, listening as he spoke about business ventures, partnerships, and ambitions. The words were like static, noise filling the air. But she noticed how his voice softened when he realized no one was challenging him directly. She had heard that tone before, not in rooms like this, but in ordinary places where people tried to prove themselves to anyone who would listen. The similarities made her smile faintly behind the professional mask she wore. People were always the same, no matter how grand the surroundings. The evening wore on, the chatter and clinking of glasses blending into a low hum that she could almost ignore if she focused on breathing. But the piano called to her, each silent note like a whisper she could feel in her bones. Her mind drifted to memories of lessons long ago, teachers who had seen something in her that she had almost forgotten existed. The thought made her heart ache, a mix of longing and regret. She wondered if anyone here could even understand what she had left behind. And then she shook her head, pushing the thoughts away. She had work to do. In this room, she was invisible. That was both her shield and her cage. She paused briefly to straighten a chair at a corner table, noticing an older man watching her, not in a rude way, but with curiosity. He had a faint smile, one that seemed to acknowledge her presence without saying a word. Something about him made her pause longer than she intended. Their eyes met briefly, and she felt a spark of connection, fleeting but undeniable. She moved on quickly, carrying herself with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to vanish when necessary. Still, the memory of that glance lingered, a tiny thread of warmth in an otherwise cold room. As the night deepened, the music of conversation changed subtly. Guests were still talking, laughing, negotiating, but there was a slight tension now, like the calm before a storm. She moved among them, refilling glasses, collecting empty plates, her presence still largely unnoticed. And yet with each step, she felt the pull of the piano growing stronger. It was not just a memory or a longing. It was a need, a part of herself she could not ignore forever. She told herself it was foolish, that a waitress should not think about music at a place like this. But she also knew that the soul rarely obeys reason. Somewhere near the middle of the room, a small incident drew her attention. A young woman tripped slightly, almost knocking over a glass of champagne. The guests near her gasped and murmured in alarm, but the woman caught herself and smiled awkwardly. In that brief moment, she felt a strange kinship with the woman. Both of them were performing roles, both navigating worlds that were not naturally theirs. The thought made her smile softly, a private acknowledgement of shared struggle. She returned to the piano again in her mind, imagining her fingers resting lightly on the keys, testing the weight, the sound, the memory. She remembered how one simple note could make a room change, how the vibration could silence arguments, stop laughter, or even make someone stop and think. It was a power she had always respected, never abused. And yet, the thought of this moment, of this particular room, made her heart race. Could she dare to try it? To see if one note, one sound, could shift the energy around her? But she forced herself to move on, carrying trays, nodding politely, refilling glasses. Her feet were tired, her back ached, and her mind was a battlefield of restraint and longing. She wondered how long she could last before the temptation became unbearable. She had learned patience over the years, learned to wait for the right moment, the right space where her music could exist without judgment. But this room, with its elegance, its wealth, its hidden insecurities, felt like it was whispering to her. Testing her resolve, the guests began to toast to some unseen success. Glasses raised high, voices blending into a chorus of celebration. She moved quietly among them, a shadow that bore witness to their triumphs and their vanity. She noticed a young man who fidgeted with his cufflinks, a slight tremor in his hands betraying nerves he tried to hide. She noticed a woman who laughed too loudly, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. The room was full of facades, each person performing a role just as she was performing hers. And in that realization, she felt both relief and isolation. She belonged nowhere here, yet she was not entirely separate from the truths the room held. The clock ticked steadily toward the later hours, the hum of conversation beginning to slow. The clinking of glasses became less frequent, the laughter less loud, the air heavier with exhaustion and perhaps satisfaction. She moved toward the corner where the piano sat once more, her heart beating faster despite herself. The urge to play, to release something real, something undeniable, was growing stronger. She reminded herself once again that she was invisible, that no one expected her to create beauty here. And yet, the very invisibility that was her cage was also her freedom. A hush fell briefly when a server dropped a tray nearby. the sound echoing oddly in the large room. Conversations faltered, eyes darted, and in that instant she felt a pull unlike anything before. Her fingers itched, her chest tightened, and a single quiet thought formed in her mind. Just one note. One single note could make the world pause, could make them hear, if only for a moment, the story she carried inside her. But she walked on, her tray steady, her posture perfect, her face a mask of professionalism. She served quietly, smiled politely, and nodded when addressed. And all the while, the piano waited in the corner, black and polished. The symbol of everything she had left behind, but never forgotten. The room was alive with wealth, influence, and noise, but she carried within her a quiet, burning spark. It would not remain hidden forever. One day, perhaps tonight, it would speak. The room had settled into a rhythm that was both loud and monotonous. The guests continued their conversations, but there was a subtle undercurrent of impatience. It was one of those moments where time felt stretched, and even the clinking of glasses sounded repetitive. She moved between the tables, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of attention that the guests maintained. Every smile she offered felt like a rehearsed gesture, every nod timed perfectly to avoid any mistake. And yet her mind kept drifting back to the piano, the black polished giant sitting quietly in the corner, untouched and almost ignored her hands. Still carrying a tray of sparkling glasses, trembled slightly as she passed it. She forced herself to focus, to pay attention to the guests' words and movements. But the urge to move closer to the piano was overwhelming. She remembered the feeling of her fingers gliding over the keys, the vibrations traveling up her arms and settling into her chest, making her heart beat in time with the music. It had been years since she had played, yet the memory was vivid and alive, demanding attention. A sudden hush fell over part of the room. A young man had spilled a drink, the glass shattering against the floor. Conversations paused, and a few guests reacted with annoyance, while others simply stared. She moved quickly to help, kneeling to pick up the shards carefully, her movements fluid and efficient. In that brief moment, she noticed a subtle shift in the room. The attention that had ignored her before was now momentarily caught. Eyes flicked in her direction, not in admiration, but in fleeting curiosity. She felt a strange thrill at being noticed, even in such a minor way. She placed the shards carefully on a tray to take away, and her gaze involuntarily drifted toward the piano once again. It was as if the incident had opened a small door, allowing her presence to register just enough to make her feel seen. She thought about how one simple sound could command attention, how one note could break the monotony and bring everyone into a shared awareness. The idea was dangerous, thrilling, and utterly irresistible. Her fingers itched, her chest tightened, and she fought to suppress the urge. She was a waitress here, not a performer. Yet the piano seemed to call her name with a voice she could not ignore, as she continued her service. She noticed subtle changes in the guests' behavior. A conversation that had been animated moments ago grew quieter. Laughter faltered and faded. Some guests leaned slightly forward in their chairs, eyes scanning the room with mild curiosity. She realized with a small shock that her presence, though unnoticed consciously, was creating ripples. People sensed something without knowing what it was, a disturbance in the predictable flow of the evening. The thought both exhilarated and terrified her. She paused near the piano, pretending to straighten a chair at a nearby table. Her fingers brushed lightly over the polished wood, and a shiver ran through her. The memory of past lessons, of late nights practicing until her fingers ached, came flooding back. She remembered the feeling of the keys beneath her, the weight of the notes, the way a single touch could fill a room with emotion. It was intoxicating. She wanted more than anything to release just a little of that energy, to let the music speak for her, even if only for a moment. The room shifted again. Someone dropped a silver spoon, the noise startling enough to make a few people glance around. She kept moving, her tray steady, but the pulse of the piano seemed to grow stronger. It was as if it was alive, waiting, urging her to step closer. She imagined placing her fingers on the keys, testing the resistance, the sound, the memory. One note, she thought. Just one note, and the room would notice. She could stop after that if she wanted. One note was enough to demand, tension without overstepping her invisible boundaries. Her mind raced with the possibilities and the dangers. What would happen if she played? Would someone reprimand her? Send her away? Humiliate her in front of the guests? Or would they feel something unexpected? A spark of genuine emotion in a world that seemed to value only appearances. The questions tangled with the longing she felt, creating a tension in her chest that was almost unbearable. She had not felt such a pull in years. The piano, once a memory, had become a presence. A living force that demanded acknowledgement. She moved carefully, pretending to adjust a napkin at a nearby table, but her eyes never left the piano. Each time she glanced at it, she imagined the sound, soft at first, barely more than a whisper. She imagined how it could stop conversations, draw attention, and create a space where time seemed to slow. She thought about how music could reveal truths, emotions that words could not capture, and how one note could change everything in a single instant. A man at a nearby table spoke loudly, his voice carrying over the room. He was telling a story, trying to impress, but there was a hollow quality to his words. She realized, almost painfully, that the music in her fingers could fill that hollow space, could make the room stop and feel something real. She could almost hear the collective pause that one note could create. The way it would demand attention not because of who she was, but because of what she could do. The idea made her hands sweat and her heart pound. She moved past the piano again, her hand brushing against its surface, as if testing the possibility. She imagined the sound of one key, clear and resonant, cutting through the noise and reaching every corner of the room. She pictured the faces of the guests, the shift in their expressions, the sudden stillness that would fall over them. It was a dangerous thought, yet it filled her with exhilaration. She was not performing for applause, not seeking approval, only answering a silent call that had waited years to be heard. The room seemed to grow heavier, more aware, though no one had yet realized why. She noticed subtle changes, a pause in conversation here, a glance in her direction there. The atmosphere was charged, expectant. She imagined the first note echoing, how it would vibrate through the polished floors and high ceilings, how it would linger in the air long after it was played. She thought of the stories she could tell, the emotions she could convey with just a single touch. And the thought was intoxicating, overwhelming. Her tray felt heavier than usual. Yes, as if it carried not just glasses, but the weight of the moment itself. She moved slowly, deliberately, her mind torn between duty and desire. She served each table with care, her smile perfect, her posture impeccable. But the piano loomed in her thoughts like a silent beacon. She longed to play, to let the music flow, even if only for a fleeting instant. The thought consumed her, making each step toward the next table a struggle between restraint and temptation. A young woman near the piano dropped her napkin, and the sound seemed unusually loud, breaking the rhythm of the room. The woman bent to pick it up, unaware of the subtle tension that had begun to weave through the guests. She moved closer under the guise of helping, her fingers brushing lightly against the fallen cloth, but her eyes never left the piano. The urge to play had become nearly unbearable. She imagined the sound, clear and simple, resonating through the room, and her heart leaped at the thought. She thought of the past, of empty rooms and late nights, of fingers worn raw from practice, and the quiet joy of creating something beautiful from nothing. She remembered the solitude, the freedom, the sense of control and expression that music had given her. And now, here, in a room filled with wealth and pretense, that same music called to her, promising the same clarity and release. One note, she thought. One note could pierce the artificial walls around them all. The guests continued their conversations, unaware of the storm brewing quietly at the edge of the room. She served drinks and cleared plates, moving gracefully, but with a growing intensity in her mind. Each step brought her closer to the piano, each glance closer to the decision she had been avoiding for years. She imagined the reaction, the sudden hush, the way one note could make people stop, listen, feel. It was a dangerous thought, but one she could not resist. Her hands trembled slightly as she passed another table. She steadied herself, forcing her mind back to service, to the role she was meant to play. But the piano's presence was unrelenting. She could not shake the memory of the keys under her fingers, the vibrations filling her chest and making her pulse quicken. One note she repeated silently, just one note, and then she could step back, invisible again if she chose. The room seemed to hold its breath, though no one realized it. Conversations faltered, laughter paused, and an undercurrent of attention shifted subtly. She imagined the sound of the note, resonant and true, cutting through the noise and reaching every listener. She pictured their expressions changing, their eyes widening, their bodies responding without understanding why. The thought sent shivers down her spine, a mix of fear and exhilaration that was impossible to ignore. Her moment was coming. She knew it. One small movement, one breath, one touch, and everything could change. The piano called to her, and for the first time in years she felt the irresistible pull of music demanding expression. She moved deliberately, her tray in hand, heart racing, every step measured. Every thought consumed by the possibility of a single note that could shift the room forever. And in that moment, she knew the night would never be the same again. She took a deep breath and paused for a moment, balancing her tray carefully as the piano loomed in front of her. The polished black surface reflected the soft, golden light, almost as if it were waiting for her. She imagined her fingers hovering above the keys, feeling the smooth surface beneath her touch. The room seemed louder and quieter at the same time, the chatter of the guests fading slightly, almost like a soft fog settling around her. She tried to steady her heartbeat, but every pulse felt like it echoed in the large space. One step, then another, brought her closer to the piano. She kept her movements deliberate, precise, pretending to adjust a chair or straighten a napkin. No one seemed to notice how slowly she approached, how careful she was, how her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts at once. She remembered the lessons she had once taken, the hours spent alone in dimly lit rooms, learning how to make one note carry as much meaning as an entire symphony. She had practiced restraint and patience, knowing that power could exist even in the smallest gesture. Now, the moment had arrived to see if she still remembered how. The guests were still engaged in their conversations, still laughing, still gesturing, but there was a subtle shift. A faint pause here, a tilted head there, as if the room itself sensed that something different was about to happen. She could feel it in the air, a current of expectation that had nothing to do with her, yet everything to do with her choice. She wondered if anyone else would notice, if anyone else would understand what she was about to do. She reminded herself that it was not about approval, not about recognition. It was about expression. It's about releasing something that had waited for too long. Her hand brushed lightly against the first key, not pressing it yet, just feeling the potential energy beneath her fingers. She closed her eyes for a brief moment and let her mind drift to the countless nights of practice, to the feeling of sound rising and filling empty rooms. She remembered how one note could make a listener stop in their tracks, could command attention without any words, without any grandeur. The memory gave her courage. She pressed the key gently, and the sound rang out, soft at first, but clear. Resonating through the polished floor and high ceilings, the effect was immediate. Conversations faltered mid-sentence, laughter stopped abruptly, and all eyes slowly turned toward the source. Some guests blinked in surprise, unsure of what they were hearing. Others leaned forward slightly, curiosity mixed with hesitation. Even the most confident and loudest among them paused, caught off guard by the purity of the sound. It was just one note, but it carried a weight that no words could convey, a resonance that touched something deep within every person present. She let the note linger for a moment, feeling the vibrations travel up her fingers and into her chest. The room seemed suspended in time, as if holding its breath. Her heart raced, but her hands were steady, guided by memory and instinct. She pressed another key, letting a short sequence emerge, restrained yet full of emotion. Each note was deliberate, intentional, speaking truths that had no name, telling stories that had never been spoken aloud. The shift in energy was palpable. Guests who had been engaged in trivial conversations now leaned in, listening with a focus that demanded respect. Some faces displayed confusion, others awe. A few attempted to hide their reaction, coughing lightly or glancing around, but the stillness could not be ignored. Even those who thought themselves immune to emotion felt the subtle pull of the music, a reminder of something essential, something human that had been forgotten in the pursuit of wealth and status. She played with careful control, never overstepping, never performing for applause, only allowing the notes to speak for themselves. A man at a table furrowed his brow, unsure of how to react. He was used to commanding attention, used to people listening when he spoke. But here, in the presence of something so simple and honest, he felt a strange humility. He leaned back in his chair, hands resting loosely, and listened without judgment, without expectation. The music demanded nothing from him except attention, and in return, it gave a glimpse of beauty he had rarely acknowledged. She continued, each note carefully chosen, each pause deliberate. The sequence was short, restrained, yet it communicated more than words ever could. Memories stirred in the listeners, amid small flashes of moments they had forgotten, the laughter of a child, the warmth of a long-lost embrace, the quiet peace of a moment alone in nature. The elite, the powerful, the wealthy, were all caught in the grip of something they could not define. The piano, once a piece of decoration, had become the heart of the room, and she, a quiet presence in the shadows, was the source. A few guests exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from skepticism to fascination. One woman leaned slightly forward, resting her chin on her hand, completely absorbed. Another man, who had been laughing moments before, now sat rigid, staring at the piano with an intensity that betrayed admiration. The change was subtle, but undeniable. She had not played a full song, had not sought attention, and yet the room had been transformed. Her fingers hovered over the keys again, considering the next note, the next brief sequence. Knowing that restraint was as important as expression, she thought about the years she had spent practicing alone. The silent hours in empty rooms where every mistake was a lesson, every note a teacher. That discipline had brought her here, to this moment, where one note could command a room of strangers, where music could cut through pretense and superficiality. She pressed another key lightly, the sound delicate but insistent, and felt a sense of release, as if a long-held weight had finally been lifted from her chest. The tension in her body eased slightly, placed by a quiet satisfaction. The room remained still, the guests listening intently, caught in the unexpected gravity of the music. She could feel their attention like a tangible force, a ripple moving through the air, and it gave her a strange sense of power, tempered by humility. She had not sought this moment, had not expected it, yet here she was, connecting with people who had seemed so distant, so unreachable. The connection was brief but profound, a reminder of what art could do when it was allowed to exist without ego or agenda. Her mind wandered briefly to the people she had been before this night, the girl who had practiced in dimly lit rooms, the young woman who had dreamed of sharing her music with the world, the person who had been forced to step away from her passion for reasons she could never fully articulate. All those experiences culminated in this moment, in this first note, in the awareness that she could still move hearts without a single word spoken. The realization was both humbling and exhilarating. A soft murmur rose from a few guests, almost involuntarily, as if they were trying to find words to express the impact of the sound. They were careful, hesitant, not wanting to appear overly emotional, yet they could not ignore the subtle shift in atmosphere. The music had penetrated the barriers of wealth, status, and pretense, reaching something deeper, something undeniably human. She continued to play briefly, each note carefully measured, never seeking to dominate, only to communicate, to offer a glimpse of what lay beneath the surface of her quiet presence. She noticed a young man at the back of the room, leaning slightly forward, eyes fixed on her fingers. There was a recognition there, a subtle understanding of the skill and emotion behind each sound. He glanced at others, realizing that they too were affected, that the room was no longer the same as it had been moments before. The change was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it was real. The music had carved a space in the room where authenticity and emotion could exist. Even briefly, her own pulse began to slow as she felt the first wave of reaction solidify. The note she had played, The short sequence that followed had opened a door, and the room had stepped through it, even if only partially. She lowered her hands from the keys, allowing a moment of silence to settle, letting the music linger in the air like a memory. The pause was deliberate, a way of giving the room time to absorb, to recognize the presence of something extraordinary in the ordinary, something meaningful in the simple act of expression. Conversations began to resume slowly, but the tone had shifted. Laughter was softer, words more deliberate, gestures less hurried. The guests were still themselves, still present in their world of wealth and influence. But the first note had left an imprint. She could feel it, sense it, in the subtle nods, the quiet glances, the brief moments of reflection that had not been there before. The piano, once a silent ornament, now carried weight, and she, the quiet waitress, had been the instrument of that change. A faint smile tugged at her lips as she stepped back, her tray once again in hand, pretending to adjust a chair at a nearby table. The adrenaline still coursed through her veins, but it was tempered by the satisfaction of having taken a risk, of having answered the call she had felt for so long. She had not sought recognition, had not demanded applause, but the room had noticed. And that recognition, subtle though it was, felt like a quiet triumph. She moved through the remaining tables with a newfound calm, a quiet confidence that had been absent earlier. The weight of invisibility had lifted slightly, replaced by the knowledge that one note, one moment of courage, could reach even the most guarded hearts. She observed the guests, now with a different perspective, seeing them not as untouchable figures of wealth and influence, but as human beings capable of being moved, even briefly, by something as simple as sound. The awareness was humbling and inspiring, a reminder of the power of quiet action, of presence, of authenticity. As the evening continued, she found herself glancing at the piano intermittently, not with longing, but with respect. It had served its purpose, carrying her voice without words, communicating more than she could have imagined. The room, the guests, the very air itself had shifted, and she had been at the center of it, silently, gently, without need for recognition. The experience moment she stepped back from the piano, the room seemed to breathe differently. The lingering notes hung in the air like invisible threads, tying the guests' attention together, making them more aware of themselves, of the space, of the presence of someone who had dared to reach beyond her role. She walked among the tables, carrying her tray, her hands steady now, her mind racing with both excitement and nervousness. Every movement she made felt more deliberate, more confident. Though the weight of what she had done lingered like a secret she had shared with the entire room without saying a single word, people were talking again. But their voices carried a softer tone. The laughter was no longer forced. Gestures were gentler, more reflective. She noticed subtle shifts in posture, eyes lingering a little longer on each other, on the music, on the waitress who had become, however briefly, the center of attention. One of the older guests tilted her head, studying the piano, then glanced toward the waitress with something like recognition. It was in that look that she first realized the truth was surfacing: her past, her talent, the reason why her music had touched something in them so unexpectedly. She paused for a moment near a quiet corner, pretending to adjust a napkin. A man, tall and distinguished, watched her with a kind of curiosity that went beyond mere politeness. He had been part of the laughter before, part of the noise, but now he seemed absorbed in thought, as if trying to piece together something he had seen without understanding. He leaned slightly forward in his chair, hands clasped loosely in front of him, and nodded almost imperceptibly as she passed. She felt a strange warmth at that gesture, a quiet acknowledgement that he, too, sensed there was more than met the eye. As she moved to the next table, she remembered the years she had spent studying music seriously, the sacrifices, the long nights, the relentless practice when her family could barely make ends meet. She had once been on a path that promised recognition, perhaps even a career, but life had other plans. Responsibilities, circumstances, financial struggles, they had all pulled her away from the piano she loved. Yet every note she had learned, every emotion she had poured into practice, had not been lost. It had stayed with her, quietly waiting for the right moment to surface. And now, in this room filled with people who had never known her, it had found a way to speak. She thought about her childhood, about the small, dimly lit room where the piano had stood, where the only audience had been the walls and the moonlight streaming through the window. She remembered how music had been her escape, her solace, her way of understanding the world when words failed. Those hours had shaped her, taught her patience, discipline, and the power of subtlety. The room had been empty, but the music had carried meaning beyond the walls, beyond the hours, beyond even her own understanding at the time. And now, years later, the lessons had proven themselves in the unlikeliest of places. A young woman at a nearby table whispered to her companion, pointing subtly toward the piano. Their expressions were a mix of curiosity and surprise, their voices low and cautious. They had recognized the technique, the precision, unmistakable touch of someone trained, someone who had dedicated years to the craft. Whispers spread quietly through the room, a ripple of recognition that began to alter perception. Guests who had been skeptical, who had glanced at the waitress as someone ordinary, now found themselves reconsidering. The aura of capability, of hidden talent, was undeniable. Even if they could not yet name it, she continued her service, refilling glasses, collecting plates, moving with the practiced grace that came from years of balancing attentiveness with discretion. Every step she took was informed by her awareness of the subtle change in the room. The music had created an invisible bridge between her and the guests, a link that allowed them to see beyond her role, to sense the depth she carried quietly within. Some glanced at the piano again, as if trying to understand how such a simple presence could evoke so much attention and emotion. They did not yet know the story, but they felt its echoes. An older man, sitting alone at a small table, shifted in his chair and spoke softly to someone beside him. He mentioned the technique, the clarity of the notes, restraint and emotion that had been evident in the brief sequence. He described it as something unusual. It's almost impossible to find outside professional circles, and his companion nodded, eyes widening slightly. The conversation spread quietly, discreetly, until a sense of curiosity, even admiration, began to fill the room. People started to look at her differently, not with condescension, but with genuine interest, with the acknowledgement that talent could exist in places they had never considered. She moved past the piano again, pretending to adjust a chair. Her hand lingered on the polished surface for a fraction of a second, a private acknowledgement of the connection she had forged. She could feel the room's energy shifting subtly, a mixture of curiosity, awe, and silent respect. She remembered all the moments she had doubted herself, wondered if her music would ever matter, if her effort and practice had been wasted. Now, seeing the response in this small but significant space, she felt a quiet vindication. She had not sought recognition, had not demanded attention, yet here it was, offered without a word, without a claim. The guests' attention gradually began to turn not only toward the piano, but toward her. It was no longer simply the music that held them. It was the presence of someone who had transformed the ordinary into something extraordinary with a simple act. A few guests exchanged quiet glances, acknowledging that they had underestimated her, that their assumptions about roles and appearances had been challenged. The realization created a subtle tension, a need to reconcile their prior judgments with the undeniable reality of her talent. It was a gentle hum of awareness that spread through the room, unspoken yet powerful. She paused near a table where a man had been speaking loudly moments before. He fell silent as their eyes met briefly, a flicker of acknowledgement passing between them. He had witnessed the impact of her music firsthand, and though he could not articulate it fully, he recognized that something remarkable had occurred. Others nearby seemed to feel the same, a quiet recognition that had nothing to do with words and everything to do with perception, with understanding, with the silent communication that music had carried. She moved on, serving with care, observing the subtle shifts that her single act had initiated. Memories of her early lessons came rushing back. The teachers who had pushed her, the hours of repetition, the discipline required to master even the smallest details. Every mistake had been a lesson, every success a confirmation that she was capable. Those years had built a foundation that she now realized had been waiting for this precise moment. A moment in which her skill, her emotion, and her courage could converge to touch the lives of strangers. She had always known music had power, but the immediacy of its impact in this room left her both humbled and exhilarated. A young man seated at the far end of the room leaned forward slightly, whispering to his companion about the subtlety of her touch, the emotional depth conveyed in each note. Others nearby nodded, murmuring in agreement. The air of casual sophistication, of self-assured wealth, had been softened, reshaped by the quiet force of her presence and her music. She realized that the brief performance had not only revealed her talent, but it also revealed something else to the guests: the capacity to recognize and appreciate excellence in unexpected places, the ability to feel beyond appearances. She moved toward another table, setting down a tray of glasses with deliberate care. Her actions were precise, almost ceremonial, each movement informed by the awareness of the room's transformation. The tension that had gripped her chest moments before had eased, replaced by a quiet confidence. She was no longer just a waitress serving drinks. She was a vessel through which the room had glimpsed something extraordinary. And while the acknowledgement was subtle, almost imperceptible, it mattered more than she could have anticipated. The piano continued to sit in the corner, its polished surface reflecting the soft light, a silent partner in the unfolding change. She glanced at it briefly, her fingers tracing an invisible path over the keys. She thought of the years of practice, the sacrifices, the nights spent alone in dimly lit rooms, and she felt a quiet pride. The music had done what she had always hoped it could. It had reached beyond the ordinary, beyond expectation, into the hearts of those who had not anticipated being moved. A few guests who had initially dismissed her presence now engaged in hushed conversation, discussing the technique, the emotion, the undeniable skill evident in the brief performance. There was an undercurrent of admiration, an acknowledgement that someone had achieved something extraordinary without seeking recognition or reward. The subtle shift in perception was palpable, changing the way the room interacted, the way the guests saw her, and perhaps even the way they saw themselves. It was a moment of quiet revelation, both for her and for those who had witnessed it. She moved to the far side of the room, her steps light but confident. The change she had initiated continued to ripple through the guests, touching those who had remained indifferent and drawing the curious closer to observation. The whispers about her skill, her restraint, her ability to convey so much with so little, spread gradually, quietly, until a general awareness settled over the room. It was not a loud recognition, but a subtle, profound acknowledgement that had altered the social landscape. She had transformed the space without demanding attention, without seeking approval. And that, she realized, was the true power of her music. Her mind wandered briefly to the countless nights spent learning, to the determination that had kept her at the piano despite obstacles and setbacks. She remembered the sacrifices, the self-discipline, the quiet moments of doubt, and she realized that all of it had led to this night. In one small, deliberate act, the night had changed quietly but unmistakably. The guests had returned to their conversations, their gestures and laughter, carrying a softness that had been absent earlier. There was still a sense of sophistication, of elegance, but beneath it, a new layer had formed, a layer of awareness, of subtle reflection, of the recognition that something extraordinary had happened without words, without pomp, without announcement. She moved among the tables, refilling glasses, clearing empty plates, but now she did so with a different consciousness. Her steps were lighter, more deliberate, informed by the knowledge that she had altered the energy of the room in a way that could not be undone. As she carried a tray of glasses toward a distant table, she glanced toward the piano. Its polished black surface reflected the soft glow of the lights, a silent partner in the evening's transformation. She remembered the brief sequence she had played earlier, the single note that had begun the ripple of change. The thought brought a faint smile to her lips. She had not sought recognition, had not hoped for applause, but the acknowledgement, quiet and subtle, had been enough. She had reminded herself, and perhaps others, that authenticity, courage, and Skill could speak louder than words, louder than status, louder than any social expectation.